Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me Season 2. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't.
Alrighty, let's get into our topic today. We are all the way at W. This is when the topics get harder to pick.
Yes, they do.
So we got a little creative with it today. Our topic today is Walking on Eggshells, Boundaries Edition. So basically, we're going to talk about, setting and enforcing boundaries with people who are resistant to your boundaries.
Mm-hmm. It's a good
Such
one.
an exciting topic. I think this is a great topic because this is everywhere. This is definitely something we all will probably encounter at least once, if not multiple times.
Yes.
And that just infinitely grows if we're talking about the South Asian community. So I'm really excited to talk about it today.
I'm ready.
Are you ready to learn?
Yes.
Before I go into anything, I want to talk a little bit about where I'm getting all the information today. So instead of grouping it specifically by where I got this information, I'm just going to clunk everything together based on themes. I felt like that would flow better. So everything today is either from, most of the early part of this is Psych Today. And then right after that is a lot of another therapist called Kate O'Brien, her therapy website's blog post. Mm-hmm. She had some great stuff, so I wanted to pull from there. And then in between all the little crevices and whatnot, I've included just observations from my experiences, my learnings, my clients and everything. So it's a little bit of a hodgepodge of all of these places. But I did want to still give a shout out to the right places.
Yeah.
So to start with, I just want to talk about okay, what do we even mean when we say walking on eggshells, right? How do you know you're walking on eggshells? Mm-hmm. So I kind of broke this down into a few different ways to identify if people are walking on eggshells. You're walking on eggshells, for example, if you feel like the conversations are always tough to keep up with. You never know if they're going to get upset about something that you said or something that you did, or if they're going to just be chill and it's fine. Mm-hmm. Right? If you feel like you have to filter yourself every time you try to communicate, you might be walking on eggshells. If they make everything about themselves, you might feel like you have to walk on eggshells. Mm-hmm. If they never hold themselves accountable for their actions, if they constantly feel attacked, if you get blamed for their mood, if you feel resentful about these interactions, and if you find yourself questioning your choices, these are all different ways that you can probably identify okay, yeah, maybe I'm walking on eggshells around this person.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but basically really what it comes down to is you don't necessarily feel safe to just be. You're constantly on high alert for how the other person is going to respond. Mm-hmm. What they're going to think. Now, apparently, when I was looking this up, apparently the most common symptom, in children who feel this way, with their parents, not symptom, I should say, the most common thing that comes out of children who are living with parents that they feel the need to walk on eggshells is depression. Mm-hmm. That's the most common thing that they experience, which I suppose makes sense. But if you think about it in one way or the other, a lot of us have probably faced that, growing up, right? A parent having maybe explosive reactions and feeling like we have to walk on eggshells. We have to be really, really aware and vigilant about how we say what we say.
Right.
Yeah. So whether it's depression or not, there's at least symptoms of depression that children often face when they go through things like that. Now in adults, it looks more so resentment, anger, at being essentially emotionally abused in this way. But let's talk also about boundaries, right? I feel especially within our community, boundaries is a very foreign concept, I've often had clients say, jokingly, they'll say, oh, that's a white person thing. I don't know what boundaries are. But that's kind of how we treat it, right? In our community, boundaries aren't really talked about. They're not really known.
Right. They're not.
Did you know about boundaries when you were growing up?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. When did you first hear about boundaries?
Probably after college. I know that sounds crazy.
Yeah. But no, same. Literally in college, when I went to therapy, is the first time I heard the word boundary. And I was like, what? What is that? I can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's exactly my point. It's crazy to think about, but it's not something that we all really just know and understand and are comfortable with. So I want to really address that. What exactly does it mean to really understand what a boundary is? So basically a boundary reflects what you will accept and what does and does not feel okay to you, right? So it's important to recognize that a boundary is not something that you say like, don't cross this line. It's not something that's going to keep somebody at arm's length and keep a barrier. Rather, it's kind of almost like an expectation. You're like sharing your expectation of what you will and will not accept around what makes you feel okay and what makes you feel not so okay. And that's a little bit different from, I think the distinction is important about like what a rule is, because sometimes that's what people think it is, a rule. But a rule is more about you trying to control somebody's actions. And I'll explain in a minute. But basically the difference between the boundaries and the rules is also like going to help you figure out how to implement the boundaries. Because it's not just about knowing what your boundaries are, which is its own hurdle. Then it's about setting the boundary, speaking that verbally or non-verbally. And then there's the whole piece of enforcing it, right? So there's all of these like steps to it. But as an example, to kind of really highlight what I'm talking about here, a rule might be sounding something like this. You can't talk about my body. That's a rule. You don't have control over somebody talking about your body or not. You don't have control over anybody else. But how this can be turned into a boundary, for example, is I am not going to engage in this conversation or listen to you speak if you're talking about my body. I'm going to need to walk away. I don't want to talk about it. Right? So you see the difference? Like one, the rule is saying like, you can't do this. Don't do this. We can't control them. But the boundary really is saying, here's what I'm going to have to do if you do this because I'm not comfortable. So setting a boundary essentially is like setting an expectation around what your desires, needs, what they are. It's being clear about what you will and will not accept, right? And that's really, really important to understand that the control lies with you. You're not asking for permission for somebody to respect your wishes. You're saying what you are going to do. You have the control if they don't respect what you need. Right? And I think that's really, really important. Has that ever been like, is that kind of what you thought boundaries are too? Or do you feel like...
Yeah, I think that's very like a good way. You explained it really well to conceptualize it because it's so abstract. It's not normalized. It's taboo in our community. So kind of making that distinction of it's a boundary comes from within yourself and not putting like not a rule that you're putting on other people. Like it's what you need to do for yourself, right?
Yeah. Which means you have the control. Yeah, that's really important. So, okay, like let's talk a little bit about like what can you do to basically like set these boundaries, right? What does that even look like? So basically if someone is not respecting your boundaries, it's helpful to maybe like start with letting them know like what you need, for example, saying like how you're going to respond to that. Like, hey, I need space, or I can't talk about this with you right now, or I can't spend time with you this Friday, right? This is like direct and to the point about what you can or cannot do. Right? Expectation setting again. Now, a note that I did say direct, right? Sometimes when I say like that, like, oh, it's about being a little bit direct, people tend to be like, whoa, I can't be direct. That's too rude. That sounds too aggressive. Nope, not wanting to do that. And like, okay, like totally normal, totally fair, especially in like a South Asian culture when we do tend to be breeding more people pleasing and like kind of molding people to be more people pleasing and more permissive. This can seem really scary.
Yeah.
But that's a fear. That doesn't mean that it's true. Being direct doesn't mean that it is rude. It just feels rude, right? And there's a way to be direct and still like soften with respect, with love. And it's important to be direct because, at the end of the day, when you're not really direct and you're kind of like wishy-washy with your words, you talk a little bit like, well, if you can, and like, it'd be nice if you did this. You kind of leave room for misinterpretation and misunderstandings, right? They don't understand like, no, this is what I know that I need versus, well, I think I need this, right? I think is really important to know because I find that that's like another one of the biggest hurdles when, clients come and we're talking about boundaries and like all of that. They're like, I don't know how to like say it. I want to be that direct. Is there another way? Yes and no, right? We can practice being direct, but being like respectfully direct. Let's see. So if you need to communicate when someone has crossed a boundary, this article goes on to talk about how it might be helpful to label the action and then identify that it did not feel okay with you. And then you can ask for the behavior that you want instead. So for example, like let's say that you're at a party and somebody makes a comment, like a friend makes a comment about your weight, whether it's positive or negative or like whatever. But if you don't want to engage in that conversation, that feels uncomfortable to you. What you could say, for example, could be something like, hey, I don't really feel comfortable talking, about my body right now. So I don't really want to talk about it. I want to get into it. Can we talk about something else? Right? You're basically stating how you feel and what you would like. Now, depending on how they respond, you can enforce it in different ways. You can, if they respond well, great. No need to enforce it. They've respected it. If they don't, respond well, which is the topic of our conversation, then you can state like what you need to do then. Well, I see that you still want to talk about it and I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to go get a drink over there. I'm going to go talk to that friend over there. Like step away. I do want to talk for a moment about this piece. Sometimes there's this like fear, I would say, of like, well, what if I hurt somebody with my boundary? What if me having a boundary hurts someone's feelings and I care about them? I don't want to be hurt. So I want to address that for a second. It might definitely be hard for others to hear and accept your boundaries.
Yes.
That happens. Totally fine, totally normal. You, if you want to, can be empathetic. You can talk about like, hey, I know that might be really hard to hear since this is new for us. But just because it might upset someone or disappoint someone or hurt someone doesn't mean that you need to change your boundaries or that your boundaries aren't okay, aren't allowed. That's not what it means, right? Like what it really means essentially is that that person might have some kind of perception of you having a boundary now and what that means to them. For example, if you've never had a boundary, but suddenly you do, they might be thinking, why are they putting this distance? Are we kind of distancing in our friendship? Right? It's not because of you needing a boundary. It's because of what they think about that, what their fear is, or, how they're perceiving it essentially.
Right.
As an example. So usually, like, for example, like when I'm working with clients who have this guilt about setting boundaries, like perhaps they feel like they owe something to their parents, or maybe their parents have like outright expressed how upset they are by their boundary.
Yeah.
I think it's important, what I like to do is I like to remind them that implementing these boundaries is often like a good thing because it means that you're trying to save the relationship. You're trying to make the relationship work because you're literally showing somebody how you want to be treated. You're teaching someone how you want to be in the relationship with them. If you think about it like that, boundaries are the thing that actually help relationships grow and strengthen. They don't create distance when received well, right? Now, when they're not received well, it can still lead to strengthening if both parties are willing to work on understanding like, okay, why? What is your perception of me even having this boundary? Like I talked about, right? If it's, oh, you're distancing, oh, that's not what it is. I'm just really not comfortable with it. And if I'm not comfortable, then I'm not going to want to, hang out with you. Or like, things like that, right? If we can break down what the fear is and talk about it, then it could still lead to strengthening. But sometimes, other people are not willing to get open, not willing to get vulnerable, and they just feel like they have, what's the word? Kind of like they're exercising their right over you. They feel entitled, right? Then in cases like that, you might need to limit your interaction with them. You might need to change how you show up with them. You might need to not be so verbal with your boundaries and maybe nonverbal, protect yourself without even having to call it out. And so when you deal with things like that, there is a grief process, right? You're grieving the relationship you used to have. You're grieving the relationship you wanted to have. That is a very real loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Symbolic loss.
Yeah. But just because you are grieving it and just because there is a loss doesn't mean that this is the wrong decision for you.
Right.
Sometimes it's about it being both. It sucks that they can't receive it well. It sucks that you're losing how things were, maybe the ease of how things were. You're losing an imagined future that you would have liked to have. And it's still the right choice for you because it protects you, takes care of you. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about enforcing boundaries when they're validated. We've been talking a little bit about setting them. I want to talk about like how we enforce them.
Okay.
So a big part of understanding how to enforce boundaries is basically, what we talked about initially, which is that you cannot control others. So you cannot control what they do, what they say. You can only ask and share your expectation. And then the enforcement piece is you saying, okay, well, if that's how you're going to play it, I got to take care of me too. And this is how I'm going to do it. You've got the control. You're not waiting for someone's permission to respect your boundaries. You have the control, right? I think it's really important to set like limits and consequences, right? Like when you're creating boundaries, you're deciding what is and what isn't okay. With that clarity, you can also decide like what action you want to take when someone isn't respecting your boundaries. for example, we talked about walking away, but there's more than one way to do that, right? You can change the conversation. You can walk away. You can also like limit the interactions in general with certain people, right? Now, what that can look like, I'm not saying this is a great example for everybody's situation, but as an example, like if your mom is yelling at you or something, and that's kind of like a boundary. You don't like being yelled at. It's not productive. Nobody likes to be yelled at, but like you don't like that is a boundary. You refuse to engage with yelling. Then what you could say, like what that could sound like is, Mom, I really want to keep talking about this with you, but I'm just not able to like talk to you if you're yelling like this. So if you're going to keep yelling, I don't think we're going to have a really productive conversation. Can we, we're just going to resume this later. I know I said, can we, but I take that back. It's not, can we resume this? Again, that's asking for permission.
Yeah.
Rather saying, let's
Being
resume
assertive.
this in the evening. Yeah. Yeah, see, even I did it, right? People pleaser right there. My instinct was to be like, can we? No, it is not a question. You are saying what you can and cannot tolerate. I can't tolerate this right now, but let's just resume this in the evening.
It's a good example.
Yeah. Again, this is a snippet, right? I mean, come evening, yes, Mom could still continue yelling and like that would look different. But this is just as an example of what it could look like. The other thing, about enforcing is to like keep checking in with yourself, right? Like keep checking in with yourself to see if there is flexibility. When we talk about boundaries and I educate clients on what that looks like, we talk about how there's like rigid boundaries where it's like my way or the highway. That's not helpful. That's typically what people tend to think boundaries are, my way or the highway. No, I mean, it can be, but that's not like the goal. That's not effective. That's not healthy. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum is like loose or porous type of boundaries, where it's like you just basically don't have boundaries. Anything, you will just take it. You're like feeling like a doormat, essentially. Now in the middle is flexible, healthy boundaries, right? Which basically state like, right now, this is what I need to do. This is how I feel about it. In a different situation, maybe I feel a little differently, right? Or given new information, maybe I'll want to do differently. It's totally okay for boundaries to be flexible. That's actually important. It's normal. And also, I think it's sometimes like I get clients who are like, well, is it okay if I change my mind? Like I kind of changed my mind. Totally. With new information, you're gonna change your mind and that's okay. If a certain circumstance means something a little bit different to you, if a certain circumstance and situation, you have more capacity, you can respond in kind with that situation. You don't have to always react in the same way. You can change your mind. And the other piece of enforcing these boundaries, like I said earlier too, being able to accept that it might come with loss. And that loss could be just how a relationship used to be. That loss could be literally that friendship or that relationship with that person altogether. It could just be a loss of an imagined future, like we were talking about. That's a very real possibility. Allow yourself to recognize that, grieve it, and also sit in the fact that while that sucks and that is a loss and there is grief, that is still probably the right choice for you. Any thoughts so far? This is a very lengthy research, by the way, so jump in when you want to.
I think this is good. I love how we're revisiting boundaries, but with like a twist, just like how we can go into deeper with it. I think the examples you're providing are really helpful and concrete because, again, this topic is very abstract and it's not taught growing up, right?
Not enough.
This is good.
Yeah. And I really particularly like this emphasis on like what to do when it's not being respected. Because we talked about it, but we talked more about like, well, you're in charge of like, this is what you can do. But this is like in depth. What if they're not respected?
Let's take it on the next level. Yeah. And it's very common. Like boundaries tend to not be respected, and especially the South Asian community because no one's used to boundaries.
Yeah.
It's not modeled, it's not utilized.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I want to talk about too right now is I want to focus for a moment on like extra challenges with someone who doesn't respect your boundaries. So, for example, if you live with the person that is disrespecting your boundaries consistently, if you are able to leave, great. But if you live with them, you probably are not able to just up and leave, right? So I think it's worth looking at and focusing on what you have in your control. Because that's sometimes things that we tend to like just forget and like we tend to feel hopeless. We tend to feel out of control, dejected when we feel like, well, I'm trying, but nothing's working. And like, it just happens every day. It happens multiple times a day. It gets tricky. We definitely need to be able to learn how to cope. Like, what are the coping tools that I can use right now, given that this is my reality? But also focusing on it from that perspective of like, yeah, what is in my control? For example, sometimes with people who just refuse to respect boundaries, you don't necessarily need to verbalize your boundary and get like a tongue lashing and like lectured every single time. You don't need to do that. You can enforce your boundaries non-verbally, right? So for example, if this person is like constantly yelling at you and like that's a boundary, you don't want to be yelled at, you don't want to deal with that kind of communication. Instead of saying it like, okay, if you don't stop yelling, I'm going to walk away, finding creative ways to non-verbally enforce that boundary. And sometimes that can look like maybe white lies, right? Like saying, okay, I've got a meeting to go to, can't reschedule, I'm running late, let's resume later. And then maybe not resuming, saying things like, oh, we're going to have this conversation, tell me about how school's going, tell me about how your dating life is going. And you're like, I really don't want to talk about this. Saying, okay, sure, but maybe later, I got to go take a shower right now and I have to go meet up with a friend. And then going and doing whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
And there are nonverbal ways to be able to enforce your boundaries. So maybe finding things like that, as well as finding things that bring you comfort of what you can control, coping, right? Like, I don't know, being able to talk to friends, being able to watch a show that you really love, those kinds of things. Another challenge, like an extra challenge on top of the challenge enough with setting and enforcing, might also look like if the person that you're trying to set and enforce a boundary with is a person of authority over you, right? Like a boss or something. Those are tricky because there are things in your control, there are things outside of your control. You're going to fear some kind of like repercussion and judgment, things like that. With this situation, just like with the previous situation, focusing on what is not in your control, really important. And within that, if you cannot leave, again, same thing. How can you cope then? How can you make this tolerable for you? How can you do your best to enforce this non-verbally without having to, talk about it? Let them know about it if you already fear that. And sometimes just like even recognizing what you have in your control, even that can be really like empowering.
Right.
Maybe empowering enough to leave, or at least empowering enough to focus on what you can do. And then the last little extra challenge I want to talk about, I think is a really common one, which is what do you do when you love the person that is, crossing your boundaries consistently, right? Because sometimes the best way to save a relationship, though, I think it's important to recognize, is by setting these boundaries. Like I said earlier, initially it seems scary. Initially it seems like you're creating distance, but you're not. In allowing somebody to know what you will and won't tolerate, how you want to be treated, you're giving them the opportunity as well as yourself to strengthen these relationships. But sometimes, that can mean like limiting topics that you want to talk about. Sometimes it can mean walking away when your boundaries are not being respected. But the boundary is not the problem, right? And sometimes it is worth looking at what exactly is serving you in this relationship, just getting curious to that. If you like evaluating like, okay, do I still want to be in this relationship? Do I not? Sometimes the right choice is leaving a relationship, even if it is painful, even if it comes with a loss, because it's right for you in the long term.
Yeah.
But even if it's not, and you decide it is worth staying, at least that one reaffirms your desire and your belief, but two, then you have to refocus. Okay, well then I'm making this active choice to stay with somebody who doesn't respect my boundaries. So what can I control in this? How can I protect my boundaries then the best way I can? Yeah. What does that look like? And coping with it and all of that. So yeah, that is kind of, I think, a pretty holistic-ish summary of what it looks like to enforce and set boundaries with people who are just not respecting your boundaries, who don't know how to accept your boundaries. But let's talk about the South Asian impact. I'm excited about this piece.
I'm ready.
So I'm going to talk about, depending on time, 2 to 3 different sources. One of the sources I want to start talking about is the South Asian Therapist Directory. SouthAsianTherapist.org is literally the directory's name. And the author of this article was Shireen. I plucked a few quotes from here that I want to talk about in random order, but they will make sense. The first thing Shireen says is that boundaries is not a language that parents understand. They have no idea when they're breaching mine, or frankly, when people are breaching theirs. I was questioned over and over again, what are these boundaries you keep going on about? And frustration at my constant use of the word. I've come to realize that communicating boundaries to a generation that does not have the words nor experience to understand them is a large part of this battle. I was like, yeah, damn, she really hits the nail on the head right there.
Absolutely.
She goes on to say, I've come to wonder whether in South Asian families we see ourselves so much as a collective that we struggle to understand where one person starts and the other person ends. We do not see each other as an individual in their own right, but as an extension of ourselves, particularly when we are the same gender, particularly parent to child. Well, I added that last piece. This is not her quote, but as my observation, at least given what she's saying. Shireen goes on to say that, if we view the world in this light, it is very hard to understand the rationale behind boundaries and adjust our behavior if we constantly think that these people are an extension of us, right?
Right.
So she says, frankly, setting and enforcing your boundaries is an upward struggle, and it doesn't happen overnight. It has taken me a very long time to understand that this struggle is worth it in order to protect my mental sanity.
It is worth it.
I really loved, in the beginning when she's talking about how, this concept is literally frustrating because they literally just they can't comprehend it. They literally cannot understand how that would apply to them, right?
It's not in their vocabulary. It's not in their vocabulary. It's not something that they can conceptualize.
No, it's not something they can conceptualize. It's not in their vocabulary. They have no experiences to tie it to and say, oh, that's what you mean. It's just not a thing, right? I really love that she kind of explained it in that way.
Yeah, as well
Particularly
written.
when she was like, oh, what are these boundaries you keep going on and on about? I was like, yeah, been there, heard that. I want to talk about I think it was a blog post or an article titled My Life with Boundaries, South Asian Women Edition. And this was by Rebecca Lovett, who is a South Asian. So there's two particular chunks that I really resonated with. She said, in a one-on-one session, my therapist asked what I found most challenging about setting boundaries. She had responded, every time I think of it, it feels like I'm being aggressive. So remember we were talking about how being direct sometimes comes off as aggressive, right? So she goes on to basically say that her therapist sat up in her seat, leaned into the Zoom screen, raised her eyebrows and said, let me reflect back to you what I'm hearing. You, a brown woman, think that you are the aggressor for setting boundary with someone who is violating your space and causing you harm? Sounds like some internalized racism to me. Whoa, right?
Yeah.
Rebecca goes on to say that her therapist's words hit her like a ton of bricks, but she needed it. She needed to hear it just like that. She needed to see how absurd that thought sounded to her therapist, to her even. She says, at that moment, she held up a mirror when I couldn't see myself. It was one of the most liberating ways to be called out, especially by a fellow South Asian woman who understood the cultural and systemic oppression that informed my thinking. It was effortless for me to vilify myself for being human, and I had to sit with that. I had to sit with why I could affirm and fiercely defend the right to boundaries for my loved ones while simultaneously denying them for myself. I needed to stop reading about boundaries and my right to have them and finally just create them.
It's powerful.
Mind-blowing. So impactful, right? Yeah. I really loved these little, sections where she talks about it in this way. And exactly, her therapist was just she was not pulling punches, very hard hitting. Hearing it like that, it really kind of shocks you into being yeah, what the hell? What? Why am I doing this? Yeah. Let's see. I think we have time for the other one. We'll talk about it.
Okay.
This one is by a fellow therapist on her therapy website. She goes by the name The Bad Indian Therapist.
Okay.
And basically I'm going to pull specific pieces of it. She kind of walks through more of the educational side of this. Really loved it, so I thought we'd talk about it. She said, for some South Asian American people, communicating boundaries can be extra challenging. Here's why. So she goes on to say that basically this can be challenging because we don't want to, make the other person feel betrayed, for example, right? If the other person or a parent is saying things like, how could you do this to me after everything I've done for you? That guilt tripping, whether it was intentional or unintentional, it's a form of them feeling betrayed and hurt.
Yeah.
And So if you know that they're kind of prone to those kinds of reactions, maybe you're hesitant because of that. You don't want them to feel that way because you care about them. And then 2, it can be hard because maybe we think that a lack of boundaries indicates the intensity of our love for someone else, right? Like basically putting on a pedestal this idea that we sacrifice our needs for the greater good of the community or somebody that we care about. We put their needs above our own to show our love, and then we hope that we receive that in return. Maybe our love language is an act of service, right?
Yeah.
We're willing to do something, anything for somebody. Prove our love, prove our loyalty, prove our dedication to them, and hope that they will do the same for us. That's where the friction also comes is, we talk about how when we people please, we kind of are operating from this perspective, but oftentimes it leads to frustration because other people don't operate that way.
Right.
Unless you're people pleasing with another people pleaser, you're not receiving that.
It's very foreign.
And lastly, the last one I'll talk about is it might also be hard for South Asian people to set these boundaries because there isn't a clearly defined adulting transition. I talk about this a lot with my clients who are new adults, as I would say, freshly adulting. There's a difference between more westernized norms versus South Asian norms when the adult kid leaves the house, right? For more white folk, maybe you're leaving at 18, maybe you're leaving during college, and that's it, you're out of the house. It's not always the same for a South Asian person, right? They might go to college and do campus stuff, but maybe they come back home for a little while before they maybe get married, and then they go off. Or maybe they still come back home and then go, I don't know, live on their own, and then they get married. But whatever it is, they're not necessarily, there's no expectation okay, you're going to get kicked out. You need to leave the house at 18. There's no age like that for us. The expectation, in fact, I would say, is more when you get married, you leave and you don't go before that, right? If anything. So that could be another reason why it might be really hard to set these boundaries, particularly around this kind of stuff, because there are no set expectations.
Right.
Yeah. So it makes it harder. I also want to talk a little bit about how there's another part of this where this therapist talks about how oftentimes boundaries can, when you start to understand them, when you start to communicate them, it can almost be seen as disrespectful. But obviously, while it might feel that way, that doesn't make it true. Boundaries are a necessity. So she goes on to describe why these are so important. What are the consequences if you don't set boundaries and enforce them? I just want to highlight a few. One consequence of not having these boundaries and firmly communicate them is that you might have trouble making your own choices because you've just prioritized your parents' wishes for so long. You might not even know, what do you want?
Right. So
how long can you live that way? 2, you might experience heightened anxiety and dread, when you're anticipating seeing that person. Obviously, if it's someone you care about, you don't want to feel that way.
Yeah.
But learning how to do this, learning how to plan for verbalizing or non-verbally enforcing your boundaries is so important so that you don't feel constantly anxious and anticipating the hangout or whatever it is. 3, you might also experience increased sense of hopelessness, loss of interest, loss of pleasure, basically depressive symptoms, especially if it's because somebody else has more control of your life than you do, especially if you're doing something for somebody else and not for you, particularly if they're about big life stuff, your career, your partner, things like that. Also, I think this is a big one too. Another consequence of all of this is that you may doubt your own capabilities and your unique interests because someone else disapproves. So you're limiting yourself from fear of their opinions of you.
Yeah.
Right? Also, you probably have trouble asserting yourself.
It's a big one.
Yeah, the people pleasing aspect for sure. And a really big one, I think, really the last thing that we need to talk about, you end up repeating the cycle of generational trauma. You pass it down. And you pass down, with this knowledge, you will also pass down the maladaptive coping for it too, right? And most people don't want that. We don't want that for ourselves, let alone our future kids, right?
Yeah.
So our possible future kids or possible future nieces, nephews, whatever it is. So I'll end on this one note though. I want to summarize with one thing that she talks about that I thought was really cool, especially given holiday season is around the corner.
Yeah.
Which means you're going to probably see a lot of nosy aunties and uncles and whatnot, right? So let's talk about that real quick. She talks about particularly this specific kind of technique. It's called the sandwich theory of boundary setting. Okay. As you can imagine, we got the top and the bottom layer same, and then the meat is the middle. Meat, the veggies, the content is the middle, basically.
Right.
And she talks about, in particular, the bread, right? The start and end is going to be appreciation, gratitude. The middle is going to be the content, the meat of it all, which is your I statement. So, I feel X when Y happens, that kind of stuff. So here's an example of what that actually looks like, right? So let's say you're at a party and Auntie corners you and wants to talk to you desperately about marriage. And you're like, oh my God, get away from me. The way that, this could look is, this is literally the quote. Thank you, Auntie, for considering me for marriage with this person. I know that it's really important to you that marriages be strong and respectful, right? But I think that people should come together and be the best version of themselves. But right now, I don't feel like I can be the best version of myself. I'm working on a lot of stuff. I'm working on me. But, I don't want to waste their time. I don't want to waste your time. If I'm looking, I'll come and I'll ask you then to find somebody nice for me. I'll come when I need your help then, because I really do appreciate you looking out for me. I know you really care. I appreciate that. But just not right now, right? You see, appreciation, gratitude. Oh, that's so sweet. That's so caring. Yeah, that's not going to happen. I don't got that in me right now. That's so sweet, though. I'm going to come to you when I need to. And of course, you don't have to mean it, right? The caveat is you do not have to actually reach out to them when you want to just because you said it. But that's just part of your process of appreciation and gratitude. Right?
Like soft boundary enforcing.
Yeah, it's a direct boundary. It is a direct boundary, but see, it felt soft because it was so jam-packed with respect and love and admiration and gratitude. Even if you don't actually feel it and mean it, it comes across at least soft that way.
It's like a little soft launch of your boundaries. I like that.
Exactly. So that is a wrap up on boundaries, how to deal with them, especially with resistant people. In the South Asian community, what it looks like, everything.
That's good. I really like the examples you gave and the concrete ways to address boundaries and enforce boundaries. I like that.
We got deep today with the boundaries. Oh yeah.
I love it.
Shall we switch and pivot over to our stories?
Yes.
Let's do it. So I, as usual, feel like I'm going to split mine up a little bit more reflection based, but here we go. As always, I'm going to start with growing up, though. So as we talked about already, growing up, I had no idea what a boundary was. I've never heard of this word. I've never heard of this term. I did not see it witnessed even as a concept. I would even go so far as to say, even though I didn't know what it was, even if I tried to be individual, try to stand out, I would literally hear. I can't remember exactly the word for it. It's not this word that they use, but I can't think of the words. I'm just going to use boundaries as an example. I would be told there's no such thing as boundaries with family. It wasn't boundaries, but I cannot think of the word right now for it. And basically to say, essentially with family, there is no distance. There is no, you can or can't do this with family. We're family. If I can't say this to you as somebody who really cares about you the most, well, then who's going to say it to you?
Yeah.
Right. Which usually came up along the context of comments that are not maybe really very welcome. Comments about physical appearance, comments about weight, comments about food, comments about how you act, comments about how you care about certain things, or interest, passions, stuff like that. And I always thought once I finally figured out what a boundary was, even understanding it, or even back then before I even knew the concept of a boundary, if I was intuitively trying to find some kind of semblance of, I don't like this, I want this, in my own babyish way, I didn't realize that enforcing it is up to me. I didn't know I had control. I saw it as I can ask, but it's like me asking for permission. Please don't do that. Please don't do this. You can't respect it. Okay, well, I guess that's that. Right? I didn't see that was in my control. You don't know what you don't know, right?
Right.
But I want to talk as an adult. This is recent examples I want to talk about. Particularly, I'm going to focus on family because I feel now as adults, the age that we are, I think I've made the kind of friends who are very respectful. So this doesn't really come out with friends. I have nothing to say about that. But in family settings, I want to talk about this for a second. So I see this come up in family now as an adult where I am this year alone. The way that I see it is it's when family tries to push you to maybe come visit them. No, you have to do this. No, it's fine. Well, if you can't do it then we're going to do it at this time. No, it's like just constantly kind of like pushing,
Right.
right?
You need to come visit. You need to come visit.
Yeah, and like if you like for example, Daddy and I went to visit his, parents, right? My in-laws,
Mhm.
and we were hanging out with them. They have like a really like huge group of friends and they're all lovely and they're very loving and welcoming to us. But I'm there because I don't get to see my mother-in-law, my father-in-law often. I want to spend time with
Mhm.
them. I want family
Right.
time. I'm not
Mhm.
necessarily always there to see their friends. I'm like, I will sometimes, maybe like once every trip, I'll go see like maybe one of them. We'll rotate, things like
Mhm.
that, right? But they just have so many friends, like a huge social circle, that sometimes some of them will be like insistent, like, no, 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 bring them. It's fine. It's fine. No, it's okay. Like, just bring them. It's okay. And we're like, I
Mhm.
don't want to go to that. Like, me and Adi have been trying
Yeah.
so hard to set this boundary with his parents and saying, do not involve us. Do not go out. Like, or not that you don't go out, but we don't want to get involved in going to all these like events. We want to spend time with
Right.
you, quality time
Mhm.
with the four of us. Like we've been trying to set that
Mhm.
boundary, but like sometimes, once or twice things come up, and when they come up, they're very insistent. Like, no, 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 come do this.
Right.
No, 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 it's fine, just do it. You
Mhm.
have these plans. Okay, well then when are you getting back? Oh, you're getting back at midnight? Ah, it's fine. We'll go get ice cream at like 1 o'clock.
My God.
Right. So like things like that, basically, just like constantly pressing on the issue. It has also shown up in like, for example, okay, Aka, if you're listening to this, I love you so much, but I'm gonna throw you under the bus here for a second. For example, one of my cousins, right? Love her. We literally like primarily moved to Dallas literally for her and the kids, more or
Mhm.
less. And we love spending time with them. But like for example, I'm an introvert, you know that. I need my like downtime on the weekend. I
Mhm.
cannot spend every weekend with family. Like that's just too draining for me. Given especially like my job, right? I need my alone time. I need to watch my
Yeah.
K dramas and read whatever.
Yeah.
But sometimes like we have these like boundary issues because like sometimes when we'll go over and like the kids are so young, we're here for them. They're like, stay over, please. And like there's only so many times I can say no. And I'm like, you know what? Okay, let's stay over.
Mhm.
But sometimes, I don't have the capacity to stay over. I really don't want to stay over. And it's hard in those moments when they're like, no, no, stay, stay, stay. When the parents are saying it, when the kids are saying it, it's so
Mm.
hard to like be like, no, next time.
Yeah.
Right? It's so hard to do that. But also with like finances, right? That's another thing that we keep getting into this back and forth with them. They're just like obviously very caring, very loving. They want to take care of us. In their eyes, we're kind of like still like
Mhm.
adult kiddos to them. And so they insist on like continue to pay for us. And we keep trying to like Venmo them and like Apple pay them because they won't let us pay in the restaurants that we all want to
Mm.
hang out and go to.
Yeah.
And that's been something that I've really had to put my foot down because they're very also putting their foot down on their end, being like, no, you're not adult enough. You're not old enough. You're not going to pay for us. What the hell? No way. We're going
Mm.
to pay. And you can't pay for yourself. No way. Let us pay for you.
It's a common argument.
Yeah. And it's like, it's coming from this place of love, obviously, but it's exhausting, right? To try to have these boundaries. Cause like, okay, fine. If I'm visiting you from like Austin and like you want to pay for me that one weekend, like, oh, I'm not gonna have a problem. You pay for me
Yeah.
one meal. Okay, sure, go ahead. I know this is how you show love. But I live here now. How many times am I gonna see you? All the time.
Right.
You're gonna pay for
Right.
me every single time? No
Yeah.
way. Right. So obviously, like I know these things kind of come from like, at least the way I see it, one of three things, right? One, it either comes from a place of like love and care, and like that's great, but that pushing is exhausting, right? And it's uncomfortable because then I feel obligated to like, okay, well, how do I pay this back? This is kind of like a debt. Once or twice, like that's fine. Every single time, how do I pay off that debt? Feels that way to me,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Two, it could also be like just an expectation, like almost like an obligation, right? That becomes a norm for them, that they feel this habit of needing to push these boundaries. They feel the habit of needing to do this for them. Like it's not even about us, right? Like, you know how we talked
Mm.
about, I think we talked about in like a past episode, season 1, where if somebody, probably a boundaries episode, where if somebody is offering something to you, like a drink or food when you're at their house for the first time, you have to be like, no, it's okay. I don't want anything at first. And then the norm is, okay, yeah, I guess I'll
Yeah.
try some,
Yeah. Or they keep
like your
pushing
first
it like, you
instinct is
have
to
to have
refuse.
something. You have to have something. Eat
Yeah.
this, eat that. Mhm.
Yeah, like that's such an expectation. That's such a norm. And I know for a fact, like I've had friends whose parents have told them, when you go for the first time, like don't say you're gonna eat this, don't say you're gonna drink this. You have to refuse. If they're giving you a gift, you need to refuse. right? And the my friend's like, well, why? I don't want to refuse. I would love a gift. But this is the expectation. This is the
Yeah.
norm. You need to refuse first. So I feel like this is an extension of that. It's become so ingrained in them to do this like back and forth battle of like, no, it's okay. Oh, I'm going to expect you to say no, but that means I have to push. Oh, you're going to say no. Okay, but I'm expected to push a bit more. And this back and forth constantly exhausting.
Yeah, I bet.
And lastly, I almost feel too like perhaps maybe these boundaries being pushed against are also done because like it's just new, unfamiliar to them. Right? Again, like if this is a norm as what's expected, it's deviating from that. So maybe they don't even realize like, okay, I can break away from this. I need to break away from this. Either way, it's an exhausting process. Even now, as an adult, I've dealt with exactly the things that I've been talking about in the last like 3 months. I'm so tired. It's exhausting.
It's exhausting and tiring. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're breaking cycles. You're making space for something that's foreign and new in our community.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. But when I deal with this level of resistance, like as you can imagine, as a people pleaser, even a recovering one, it's really hard, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like initially I had such a hard time enforcing. I could set it, but I could never follow through. I could never enforce it. I could never take control and say, no, it's not up to you, it's up to me. I could never do it. I really just struggled. And then I would inevitably feel so much resentment at them, at myself, anger. And I was like, oh, this is just not working.
It's not a good feeling. Yeah.
It's not good. But I will say, last thing I'll say is this is what I've kind of learned. This is like my new MO. This is what I will do now. Now, what I've basically been doing is like once, maybe twice, I'll say my boundary. I'll say, no, I don't think we're going to stay. We have other plans, but we'll let you know if anything changes.
There you go. It's good.
If they push on it, well, what about it like this? And I'm saying, maybe one more time. Well, I know I hear that, but I really want to, but I can't. Like, I'm so tired. I just don't have it in me to do that right now. So maybe next time we can do that.
Yeah.
And I'll say that. And then if they keep pushing, that's when I will stop. Like, I'm not going to verbalize anymore. It's too exhausting to keep saying the same thing. Instead, I'll just shrug my shoulders. I'll just smile. I'll just like kind of like shake my head. But that's it. I will not verbalize another word because it's so exhausting to keep repeating yourself.
It is exhausting.
And it also kind of, I think, enables the person to keep the back and forth going. But if I just stop talking altogether and they see that I'm not engaging anymore and I'm just like non-verbally just kind of being like, and they can see that clearly that means I'm done. That's like, okay, all right, fine. I can't win this. And if I do it enough times, I've noticed that with consistency and sticking to that and enforcing it consistently, they start to just feel like they might still like grumble. They might still try to push, but it'll become less and less.
Right.
Less intense, less amount of times.
Right.
Still
You're not changing your mind.
Whatever.
Yeah.
It's still a win. Yeah. So that's kind of my experience with boundaries, particularly like what to do and how often it happens when people are really, really resistant to your boundaries.
I love it. Thanks for sharing your experience. I think I resonate and relate to a lot of those experiences too. I really like not only how in your research you gave the concrete examples, but then you brought those examples to life in your story. That was really good. And I really appreciate you, the fact that you kind of were vulnerable. You were vulnerable and you kind of shared how exhausting it can be and it can be draining.
Yeah. I'll let you know if I get a message from any one of these people I talked about.
Yeah, it's okay. It's coming up from a place of learning and reflection. Yeah. That's what we're doing, right?
No names are mentioned.
Episode. Yeah, exactly. Okay, you ready for my experience, my story, my take on this? So, as we have always done, whenever the one person does research, the other person doesn't do any research, kind of takes the topic and makes it their own. So, I really like the fact that we decided to revisit boundaries, but also add that twist and kind of take it one step further. Because I feel like our first episode was more of like an introduction, but we didn't really hit on like, what if there's resistance? What if there's extra challenges? How to go about that? Or what are some real life examples we've been through and how we combated that and how we overcame those challenges? So when I was thinking about the topic name that we said, walking on eggshells, I thought it was a very accurate analogy. Growing up, I feel like I did this a lot as a chronic, but now recovering people pleaser. in the household I grew up in, my mom's reactions and emotions were pretty unpredictable. So I
Mm-hmm.
often found myself walking on eggshells, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to say or do anything that would upset her. The more I worked, like later on in life, I started working more on my own emotional regulation, right? Like, so the more I kind of started working on myself and how I regulate my emotions, how I became more of an observer rather than like a reactor or someone that reacts easily, I started noticing my mother's like more like emotional dysregulation that she would exhibit. And that was the reasoning of her unpredictability, her, getting upset easily, her irritability. And, with that observation, kind of achieving my own emotional regulation, but then also becoming an observer and noticing, like, okay, her emotions are dysregulated. That took a lot of time and work, but I found a way to view my mom and her emotions separately. So, like, it was my mom and it was her emotions. Those were two separate things. So instead of reacting to my mom's emotional dysregulation with my own emotions, because that's what tend to happen probably in my whole entire childhood and growing up until I started doing therapy and working on my emotions and my coping mechanisms, I started not reacting. I started becoming an observer. And that act alone empowered me to not only like set, but enforce my boundaries. And, reflecting on what you said with our South Asian culture, it's not a surprise and not uncommon why boundaries are so abstract and are so, not welcomed openly in our community is because our culture as a whole is so collectivist. There's no room for individuality, and boundaries center around individuality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if we have this culture that's all about collectivism, it's all about family, family first. We are all together. We all face adversities together, which can be also protective and strength, but that sometimes doesn't leave room for boundaries. And sometimes boundaries need to be forced into this, realm. So, an example that comes to my mind when I had to kind of set boundaries, but I received some resistance was not too long ago when I was wedding planning. My fiance and I kind of set our minds, like we made a decision together where we wanted to get married, like the location, the city. And, some people might share this tradition where, it's tradition for the wedding to happen in the bride's hometown, like where she grew up, right? And so that city that we decided it didn't match that. And so when I shared that with my mom, her expectations were for us to get married in my hometown. She was, upset. And again, I use the I statement or like the we statement, like, oh, like me and Aliman, we decided that we want to get married in this city. And, she was not too happy about it. She reacted emotionally. And, I was able to, again, view her emotions and her separately. So instead of using my emotions to react to her, I just listened. And I almost naturally, like I learned about the sandwich method from you today, but I kind of feel like I naturally did that where I kind of listened to her, kind of let her speak, like give her the time to kind of simmer down and speak and what she wants to say. Because we all know like mom sometimes likes to keep going on and on and on. So I gave her the space to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
once there was a moment and a pause, I kind of spoke very calmly, not reacting emotionally. And I said, we both decided that this is what we want. Right. And I was firm, I was assertive, it was to the point. I also validated her emotions. I said, like, I hear you. I know you want this for us, but this is what we want. And we we love you and we want you to be happy. We want you to enjoy the wedding, but like, this is what we want. And at first she simmered down, but then throughout the wedding planning process, which is, full year and a half, as you know, right? During that time period, it would come up multiple times. Like she would bring it up every now and then, like, wait, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you guys are doing this. I kept on bringing up. And like you said, it can get exhausting, like repeating yourself. So I started becoming very consistent with my answer to like, we already decided this. We've already booked the venue. Like, this is what we're doing. And I hear you. I know you want this for me, but this is what we want. And it was like, just like that consistency, like you said, just following up with my word, but also not applying my emotions or reacting emotionally. And so, like, I would say, like, in my opinion, boundaries are
Sorry, I had to laugh. Cutie Bella
what?
behind you
Oh,
is
yeah.
just, I could see
I
one of her
know.
little
You
eyes.
see her little ears.
Oh
She
goodness,
wants to
Bella
be on the
is a
podcast.
whole husky.
Podcast. She wants attention.
Like,
No, it's okay. So I was saying, like, lastly, like, I just want to say, like, in my opinion, boundaries are set and followed through when they're separated from emotions, because I feel like as a collectivist culture, especially in the South Asian culture, like emotions are used a lot to kind of not manipulate, but like skew other people's opinions, skew their decisions, right? Guilt trip, like, oh, like I know you want this, but I want this. And I'm
totally
your
unintentional
elder, right?
manipulation. Maybe even intentional.
Yeah. So I think it's when you separate emotions from your boundaries and understand and accept, the biggest thing for me was my like the other people's reaction to my boundaries are not my responsibility. Like the emotions that they have that comes from my boundary is not my responsibility. Like when you separate emotions from your boundaries, whether it's your own emotions, other people's emotions, it can become easier to set those boundaries and then stay consistent with them and enforce them. Because, like you said, resistant people can use emotions to reject boundaries or disrespect boundaries. So that was kind of like my reflection and my journey with boundaries too, especially with people that are resistant to resistant, is that finding that key, which is like the emotions. Like you need to separate that. Boundaries like are logical, right? Like they could look at it as in a logical point of view and not like mixing that with emotions. Yeah. So yeah, that's my story.
Thank you for sharing. See, you were so vulnerable too. I feel like that's just what ends up happening when we talk about things like boundaries. It's a
Yeah, they're
vulnerable
hard.
thing and we're not used to it. It
We're not.
ends up with us being a little bit vulnerable, you know? And I just want to say, like you said, there are a few things I think that tie our stories together, right? It's the recognition of consistency being super important, a recognition that in our culture, we're gonna get somebody at some place, sometime who's gonna be resistant. And like that resistance can continue on with them if they're not willing to like kind of respect, learn, and grow because it's about them. It's not about us. It's not about us setting
Right.
these boundaries. It's just that they're not used to this. They don't know how to deal with it even. They don't know how to feel
Mm-hmm.
about it even. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not our responsibility, right? That's
Yeah.
what you said. And also recognizing that in this not being our responsibility, it can be exhausting to have to repeat ourselves, but we
Yeah.
can find, again, number one, consistency in a short phrase or a short repetitive action that you kind of say in your mind. Like for me, it was I'll say it twice and then I'll just kind of
Yeah.
non-verbally nod and smile and ignore. For you, it's like that one phrase and you keep saying that one phrase and like that's
Mm-hmm.
it. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
like consistency and recognizing, you know what, that's not on us. Your reactions are
Mm-hmm.
your reactions and you're allowed to feel your reactions, but that doesn't mean that my boundaries aren't welcome here. Yeah.
Wow.
All
Love it.
right. I loved
You
our
ready for
episode
it? Ready
today.
for me to wrap us up?
Yes. Let's wrap this up.
Okay. All right. To our wonderful, amazing listeners or viewers of our YouTube video, if you're watching, we would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your feedback, your comments. You can reach us to our email, which is talksouthtasiantome@gmail.com, or on social media, our handle is @talksouthtasiantome. We would love to hear from you. All right. Bye, everyone.
See you next episode.